You can't comply your way out of tyranny. This is one of the most important and most forgotten principles from the American Revolution. On this episode, I'll uncover some highlights of the most powerful warnings from leading founders and old revolutionaries about the dangers of compliance with unconstitutional acts, with usurpations of power. Plus, from a century later, a guy named Lysander Spooner, someone we should all be at least a little familiar with, who told us much of the same. These are lessons we absolutely can't afford to ignore any longer. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, November 6th, 2024. Let's get right to it. First of all, with the principle that acts that go beyond the Constitution are void. And that's how the third Chief Justice put it, Oliver Ellsworth, during the Connecticut Ratifying Convention. He said, if they make a law which the Constitution does not authorize, it is void. And I'm wearing the shirt for this one for those of you who are watching the video version here. James Otis Jr. at the beginning of the American Revolution in 1761. This is the radical change in the viewpoints of the people in the years that led up to the shot heard round the world and the War for Independence. Here he is in his speech against the writs of assistance, February of 1761, making that same point. An act against the Constitution is void. And this was the same even for the unwritten British Constitution. And then about a century later, here's Lysander Spooner in his great essay, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves, one of my favorites, if not my favorite from him. He said, an unconstitutional statute is no law in the view of the Constitution. It is void and confers no authority on anyone. And the reason the founders, the old revolutionaries, and then also Spooner years later, they warned about this is because, well, government always grows. It is the nature of government to always seek to expand its power. And every single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, even the smallest one, establishes a precedent for them to do more and more and more of the same in the future. Here, for example, John Dickinson is in his very powerful and influential broadside urging non-compliance with the Stamp Act in 1765. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. This was even for people who thought that the taxes on the Stamp Act or from the Stamp Act were small. They were small enough that you didn't want to stick your neck out and risk it. But he was talking about the precedent, the principle that the government could start doing this. And once they start doing one thing, they're never, ever, ever going to stop. And that's why he said, if you comply, you fix, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. He continued, you unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. And then just less than 2 years later, in response to the hated Townshend Acts, Dickinson wrote a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. There were 12 of them that he wrote in late 1767, and they published from there and into 1768. He passed them along to people like Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr. These were the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. It got him the name the penman of the American Revolution. And here he is talking about this precedent once again. He said, when an act injurious to freedom has once been done and the people bear it, the repetition of it is more likely to meet with submission. He was just a student of history. He was a student of human nature. He was a student of government. He understood that these types of things, anytime they attack your freedom and the people go along with it, then, well, it's going to keep happening more and more and more. And he continued. He said, for as the mischief of the one was found to be tolerable, they will hope that of the second will prove so too. And they will not regard the infamy of the last because they are stained with that of the first. Thomas Paine, in Rights of Man, Part 2. I believe this was published in 1792. These will all be linked to in the show notes. I'll mention that in just a moment. He described it like this: government by precedent, without any regard to the principle of the precedent, is one of the vilest systems that can be set up. Now, we're not officially under a system of precedent, but if we all understand human nature and these maxims about government power always growing, we're establishing unwritten precedents every time we comply in large numbers to unconstitutional acts, to usurpations of power, theft of power that rightly belongs with the people of the several states, that they never delegated to these agents who are supposed to be working for them. Again, Payne said, government by precedent without regard to the principle of the precedent is one of the vilest systems that can be set up. In numerous instances, he continued, the precedent ought to operate as a warning and not as an example, and requires to be shunned instead of imitated. But instead of this, precedents are taken in the lump and put at once for constitution and for law. Now, we could read into this. I can give you my own take on it. In essence, what I'm seeing is the precedent, when government goes beyond their limits, the precedent should be they get slapped back into shape, slapped right back into their constitutional box so quickly that this is a warning not to do it again. But when people don't take the right approach in response to usurpations of power, it becomes, well, taken in a lump and eventually becomes part of the system, even though it's not supposed to be. And Lysander Spooner talking about the British system, but also this was applicable to any government. Here in his essay on the trial by jury in 1852 said, one innovation was cited as a precedent. Precedents made customs, and customs became laws. And Thomas Jefferson, that's why I think he thought it was so important to not allow government to take even the smallest step beyond the limits of the Constitution. And that's how he described it in his opinion on the constitutionality of the First National Bank, Hamilton's National Bank in 1791. Of course, Jefferson took the no side. Unfortunately, we ended up with it anyways. But here's how he described it. February 15th, 1791, 10 months to the day before the official ratification of the Bill of Rights. He said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. So if you allow them to go beyond their limits, whether it's because you think it's an emergency or because it's too trifling, or you can't deal with stopping them, whatever the reason, or you think it's a good idea, soon as you give them that extra power, they have no limits. They know that they can come up with another reason to go beyond their limits of power, and again and again and again. That's why we've often made the case, I know my friend Brian McClanahan goes a little bit earlier, we make the case that the Constitution, things for the Constitution actually went off the rails not in the 19th century, not in 1913 or 33, but in 1791 with the passage of that First National Bank. Unfortunately, it was signed by President Washington, but still, he did have some very good advice in his farewell address on this specific thing as well, on this issue of precedent and usurpation. He said, he basically said, if you don't like the structure of the Constitution, how the powers are divvied up, or if there's too little power out there, then change it in the way that the Constitution provides, the amendment process. But he said, let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So usurpation of power is a weapon. He said the precedent, again, it's the precedent, must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, these will all be linked to in the show notes, these original source documents, because I'm just scratching the surface, and I think it's really a great idea for you to read at least some, if not all of these, in full context on your own time so you understand what I'm citing from. And generally, we organize a blog post. Well, Alan Mosley organizes the blog post for every episode, and you should check out his show, It's Too Late, as well. But he organizes a blog post and I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. All spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And there you're going to find not just the show links, but we put them in the order, basically, of how I'm going through them in each episode. But there's also all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and X and LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitch. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. I appreciate you, whatever platform you happen to be on. And we also have the show as a podcast audio only on every platform, at least we can think of. So if we're missing from one, please do let us know in a comment in the archives or email us, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, the show notes blog post for this episode will be published in a couple of hours over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So we're talking about usurpations of power are void. They're void in principle because, well, you have to oppose them because otherwise you establish a precedent for them to do more. But stopping that precedent from taking hold is not about trying to convince the government to stop doing what the government wasn't supposed to be doing in the first place. That is, in essence, a system of arbitrary and unlimited power. That's not what a free people do. That's what a population does when it's on its knees begging for permission. Here's Thomas Jefferson in his Kentucky resolutions of 1798 against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. He said, "The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers." So the Constitution is a supreme law of the land, whether the federal government happens to agree with what the Constitution says or not. Even Alexander Hamilton can get in on this party. Here from Federalist number 33, discussing the Supremacy Clause, he says, "Acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers," but I think he said are invasions of the powers reserved to the smaller societies, "these will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such." Well, how do you treat things as such? Do you just ask the government, stop doing this? Do you beg the government? Do you sue the government in the hopes that part of the government will stop the other part of the government from doing the things that were never delegated to the government in the first place? Well, Lysander Spooner pointed out the absurdity of this again in his essay on the trial by jury. He said, "Tyrants care nothing for discussions that are to end only in discussion. Discussions which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them." And this principle, this understanding, was really there during the American Revolution and the founding generation. That's why so many people during the ratification debates told us about enforcing the Constitution over and over and over and over. That the only way to stop usurpations of power, the only way to stop unconstitutional acts, not just something you try as a last resort, but the only way is through the people themselves. And here's how James Iredell put it. He was one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court, top legal mind, leading legal scholar. He was nominated for the role by George Washington. And here he is in the North Carolina ratifying convention in 1788. He said, "The only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise." I mean, there is so much in that statement. First of all, it's the only way to deal with usurpation. Usurpation is an exercise of any power not delegated to the government. Usurpation is theft of power. So anytime they do this, anytime they go beyond their limits, the only way to deal with it is what? The inherent right of the people. This isn't a constitutional right. We don't have to look to a document that is, well, look to a document that is supposedly going to give people rights to do stuff. I mean, that's flipping the entire system upside down. because it's not the government that created the power of the people. It's the other way around. And the people, as the fountain of all power, can resume that power whenever they want. So ultimately, it is the inherent or natural right of the people to prevent its exercise, not to beg the government to prevent its own exercise, but to prevent it. And Iredell went on to say that the people will resist when the government usurp powers. Now, I think he had a probably much more positive view of how things were going to play out, but that's how it was supposed to be done. Now, back to that broadside against the Stamp Act from John Dickinson. He put it like this: the Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. It's a test of your backbone, is really what it is. He said, if you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. And he did not pull any punches, and this was one of the guys who was seen as a total moderate, even at that time. And the moderates at that time were saying, usurpations of power are really a test of your strength, of your backbone, and your resolve, your willingness to take a stand. And James Otis Jr., here he is in 1767, writing as free-born American. These pen names they use were awesome. This is a paraphrase, but it'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read it in full and the context. He said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. So one of the leading sons of liberty, one of the first people to take a stand against the British at the beginning of the American Revolution, he's telling us that the worst thing that people can do is to comply with unconstitutional acts, comply with violations of our rights, rather than take a stand, nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. Man, Lysander Spooner really, really nailed it with this. I think this ties it really all together to explain what we're up against and what needs to be done. This is from his No Treason, number 6 in 1870. He said, the lesson taught by all these facts is this: as long as mankind continue to pay national debts, so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long there will be enough to lend the money for those purposes, and with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection. This is at the very end of this text, and he closed it out with this: but when they refuse any longer to pay for being thus cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they will cease to have cheats and usurpers and robbers and murderers and blood money loanmongers for masters. Man, that guy had a way with words. And there's really no difference, even though he was far more radical in many areas, there really is no difference between what Spooner had to say, what Dickinson had to say, James Otis Jr., and many others, of the underlying principle. That is, compliance in essence is violence against ourselves, violence against our own liberty, violence against the Constitution, because you're basically telling government it's okay to do what they're doing, and they're going to come back with more and more of the same. Samuel Adams, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette, the organ of the Sons of Liberty in 1771, put it like this: let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. Now, if you are anything like me at all, you never learned any of this stuff in government-run school. And I think this is probably because government doesn't like people learning how to stop government from doing stuff without relying on the government to somehow magically do what it never does, and that's stop itself. And I think that approach is a terrible and extremely dangerous approach for the Constitution and liberty, and that's why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people with these essential foundational principles, and nothing helps us do that work every day more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. So if you got a couple of bucks or more of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you prefer to make a one-time donation without signing up as a member, I know some people prefer that option. Whatever is good for you is good for us. We're very grateful for your support. You can also pitch in over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And I do want to take a quick moment to say a very fast but a very big thank you to a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. I couldn't be more grateful for your support. There's Mark in Arizona, Elizabeth in Georgia, Cody in Kansas, Al in Florida, Jacqueline also in Georgia, Ray in Tennessee, Bernie in Arizona, and Mary in Louisiana. Again, I really am extremely grateful for your support. I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. Again, if you want to join us and join our new members as well, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help us spread the word by hitting the like button, subscribing, getting notification, leaving reviews on podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, etc., leaving comments all over the place. All these things can tell those mainstream platforms, whoa, hey, algorithm, you should show this program to more people. And we find that we're reaching and teaching more people than we ever thought possible. But now I'm thinking we're just still scratching the surface. So I'm grateful for any support you can give us, whether financial, otherwise, or both. Again, I really appreciate your efforts. I appreciate you being here. Hope you enjoy this information as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. And I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.